Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I hope you found the opening plenary helpful, and now you're in the right place because we're going to start with a really important conversation. We also received a whole lot of questions during the registration and comments. If you might recall, we asked people to share both challenges and to ask questions. And to be honest, the questions and the challenges that were posed in the registration process really confirmed why we're having this session. Because what I saw was lots and lots of comments and lots of questions that were one way or another about guns in your communities or about youth violence in your communities. We want to get into that. We don't want to avoid it. We want to use this time to really talk about all of that. I saw really good questions, good nuanced questions, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to use that time to get into it. So we're going to get into it. So before I start, I want to make sure I'm introducing the incredible panelists that we have today, who will be doing most of the talking, I hope, at this point. First, I'm going to introduce John Choi. John Choi was sworn in as the first Korean-American chief prosecutor in the country in 2011. Since taking office, John has become a state and national leader in progressive justice reform, working with public officials and impacted communities to reimagine justice and the role of prosecutors. John's innovative approach to holding abusers accountable while working collaboratively with advocacy agencies to help victims has transformed the way government intervenes in domestic violence and sex trafficking in Minnesota. John is now determined to do the same for victims of sexual assault. In addition, John has been a champion of raising boys and engaging men to prevent violence against women and girls, successfully advanced legislation to reunite families when it's in foster care systems foster children's best interest, developed the use of lethality assessments and GPS technology to keep domestic violence victims safe, increase second chances by diverting people before they are charged, successfully advocated to reform state drug laws, and reinvest savings in community-based solutions. John's done a lot. I can keep going on and on, but I want to hear from him about what he's doing. And then JT Timpson, who I've had the pleasure to know for a few years now. For over 20 years, JT Timpson has developed extensive expertise and leadership in violence intervention initiatives. JT previously helped drive the successful expansion of Roca in Baltimore, and he'll talk about that, about Roca and what that means. And he was a founding director, and he has now joined the Roca Impact Institute as managing director of community violence initiatives, working all around the country. He serves as a subject matter expert on building community partnerships, safety and risk mitigation, understanding brain science, trauma and behavior change interventions. JT oversees and scales the Roca Impact Institute's training and coaching initiatives with community violence intervention programs across the country. He cultivates strategic partnerships and fosters national visibility for the Rewire CBT, and he's going to talk about that as an individual behavior and systems change strategy. JT is well known across Baltimore as someone who you need to talk to when it comes to understanding young people and youth violence in our city here. So we are really lucky to have both of you here today. So I'm hoping we can get into it. You know, this session, like we said, gets into the interrelated issues of guns and violence. While the headlines may be alarmist that we see, the problems of guns and violence are real and they run deep. So what do we do to address youth violence without falling back on approaches that we know don't work and too often create harm when we want to be helping? So that's what we're gonna talk about today. So I guess I want to start off. I'm going to first start with John, and then we'll go to JT. And I just want you to talk a little bit just about yourself, your role, and sort of how it connects to these issues, and then we'll get more into answering some of the questions.
Thanks, Nate. And I'm really happy to be here today because I think this is a really important conversation that we need to have. And I love the fact that you put this in the category of short-term challenges, because my hope is that some of the things that we've been experiencing of late will pass and we can get back to the work that we've been trying to kind of further. And I love how you kind of framed all of this, because I do think that right now it's a critical time. I think in many ways, the way that I feel as the elected chief prosecutor in St. Paul, Minnesota, and its surrounding suburbs, I feel in many ways, and I think many prosecutors and judges and others who might be on the elected side of things are feeling a lot of pressure. And I bet you that this pressure and this sense of things not feeling right in our community was very similar to what many people may have been experiencing maybe back in the 90s. And I think that one important thing that we have to keep in mind is that we cannot repeat the mistakes that we made during that time period when we doubled down on the things that just simply have proven to not work. The over-criminalization of our communities, developing strategies that focus on really petty types of arrests and cycling people through the criminal justice system. I loved what Liz Ryan had to say earlier about the data that in the research that the agency has been focused on going backwards in time to look at actually the effectiveness of whether or not that type of traditional approach has worked. And we've done similar type of work here in Ramsey County where we've gone back 10 years and just we've looked at the transformation of our youth justice system. But one thing is clear is that when we arrest, when we process young people through our criminal justice system and label them with convictions and future collateral consequences, that for a big part of our population, the repetitive nature of just doing this over and over again isn't working. In fact, it's leading to a predictable connection to our adult prison system and further incarceration and further harm in our communities. And so I think that orientation and grounding is really important, but at the same time, I have to say that it's been really hard, ever since I would say for me, maybe about February of 2020 is probably when the peak occurred for me in terms of just the calls to the office, the demands to do things differently, suggesting that the things that we have been doing were not working or are not working, and a demand to kind of go back to more of a traditional type of approach. And we have to keep in mind that that version of safety is really premised on protecting certain people in our community safe, or at least making them feel safe, and not focusing on our entire community. And so I'll stop there because I think there's so much more that we're going to delve into some of the details, but I really think that this is a really, really critical time. It's a critical time to bring people together, to not lose our focus, and to remind ourselves that the work that we have been doing to having less reliance on a correctional type of response, over relying on police, simply hasn't worked and hasn't delivered the results that I think people want. That's a hard conversation, and we'll talk more about that.
Thanks, John. JT?
Yeah, good afternoon. I guess it's afternoon or morning. Afternoon for some, morning for others. Pleasure to be here. I'm JT, as you all heard, Managing Director for CBI for Roca Impact Institute. But when we first started, I was the co-founding director for the Roca expansion site in Baltimore 5 years ago. And what I knew when Roca first came in, a couple of things. When I met with our founder and CEO, Molly Baldwin, about her bringing Roca to Baltimore, and she told me the way that Roca operated, I told her, absolutely not. You must be crazy and out of your mind to tell me that we have to develop a program that works with police or law enforcement. Because all of my years of doing CBI intervention work, I was taught that was just completely taboo. That was against the way that we operate. We don't talk to prosecutors. We don't talk to law enforcement. All these things that we don't do. But what made sense to me the most was she said, you got to trust the process. And when I really started to understand the model and what they really meant about working with young people at the center of urban violence and really just understanding the nature of violence, like it really shifted my perspective. And I started to say, well, if you're really doing this work, you absolutely have to work with those partners, because those are the ones that are in contact with our young people the most. So our intervention model is really based on working with a high-risk group of young people In Baltimore, we work specifically with young men ages 16 to 24-year-olds. Again, we say at the Center of Urban Violence, what that means is those young men who are just highly criminally involved. I mean, they're out there, they're your shooters, they're your trigger pullers, they're your victims. They live that life, they're stuck in that life. So that's the population that we work with. And the reason why we work with that population specifically is because most programs we find are built for the kids who aren't high risk. So that means that if you go to a program and you carry a gun, they're going to kick you out. Well, that's counterproductive. We need to be able to help that young person who's carrying the gun so he doesn't carry the gun anymore, not kick him out of a program and eliminate his opportunity for getting services. So we really think about how we service high-risk young people. It's funny because I think Nate and I were talking about this where we said, like, Molly always says, like, if a person can show up to the program, they're not a fit for Roca, right? If the kid is showing up voluntarily, he's not a fit for us. I don't want young people who can show up on their own. I want the ones who don't show up, the ones who are not ready, willing, and able, the ones who I have to hunt down or I have to go find in the trap, in the trenches, because those are the ones that really need the services or really need the help. And so through our behavioral intervention model, we really are designed on behavior change. It's not just a 6 month, 12 months quick fix. We work with these young people for 4 years to really promote that behavior change, because understanding brain science really expand my knowledge of the work, because understanding brain science, now I know that it takes at least 18 to 24 months to start seeing any type of sustained behavior change. So if I'm working with them for 6 months, I'm not giving them a real opportunity. If I'm working with them for 12 months, I'm not really giving them an opportunity. It's going to take that 4 years. So we start off with really just the way that we go after young people really relentlessly. I like to say that young people in our program are one of two things. They're either voluntold or volunteered. And that looks the same to me, because once I get your name and your number, you're mine. I don't care whether you have to comply through court or not. It doesn't matter. I'm going to come after you the same way that we do any other young person. It's about really finding them because they don't want to be found. So if you're too easy to find, then we love challenges. Let me just put it that way. At Roca, we love challenges. So we find these young people, and then it's about what do we do to support them? Well, then there's the behavior intervention model where we use CBT to really try to foster behavior change. But through our social enterprise, our work crew, we actually have a pay for work program. We send young people out to work. They get paid for about 30 hours a week. They get paid real minimum wage, but it's not about the work. It's a practice ground for them to practice their behavior change. Remember, we're talking about high risk, deep and young people. How many of them are actually prepared to go to work? How many of them actually know what working really is? How many of them know how to get up in the morning and get dressed on time? How many know how to come to work in uniform? How many know how to deal with workplace conflict with supervisors and coworkers? Right? So our social enterprise is designed to really teach young people how to work, how to show up to work. We like to keep them there for about 18 months before we send them to any outside employment, because we know what's going to happen if we don't. They might go and implode at an employer, and then they get categorized or labeled again, right? So we try to reduce that harm by making sure that we're treating the trauma up front in a way that's going to allow them to at least have an opportunity to be successful in the workplace. The other piece I'll talk about really quick is our engaged institution piece, is where I kind of started. We kind of understood that working with law enforcement was really critical, and working with prosecutors was really critical. I think I met John at the National Prosecutors Conference in Salt Lake City, and that was like a big shock for me, because I'm like, what the heck am I doing here at a National Prosecutors Conference? Like, I was just so out of my element. But after I understood, it made perfect sense. Like, wow, like people are really looking for change and really trying to figure out ways to do things differently. We should be at that table, because that really helps and benefits our young people in the long run. How do we have these collaborative conversations with prosecutors, with law enforcement, that really benefit the communities that we all want to serve? That's what it boils down to at the end of the day. We all want to serve our community. We all want our community to be safe. So it took a big stretch for me to have to lay down the thinking that I've been raised in for 20 years doing this frontline work, and understand, like, no, we got to change this narrative. We got to change this narrative and really understand what true collaboration really looks like that save our young people. Because here's the other reality. Every day that we sit fighting each other, young people continue to die. So how productive is that? So, we really have to shift around how we think about how we service this population and how we really get the best results for the young people who we're trying to reach. And I'll stop there.
And that's great. And of course, you already got me thinking about things more than the questions that I was going to ask. So I actually want to go to John here before we get into the next question, because John, when we talked before the meeting, you talked a lot about collaboration, and I'm just wondering whether you could weigh in where JT was going, because it seems like a big part of your focus in Ramsey County.
Yeah, I think that the key to our solutions are actually finding ways in which we can collaborate. In other words, pull. I think some days I feel like everybody's pulling, but if we're not pulling in the same direction, we're not going to accomplish a lot of things. And I think right now, at this moment in time, there is so much arguing that's happening across this country about the need to be right and not finding those common spaces. I mean, at the end of the day, we all want better outcomes from kids and families, right? And the truth is that we have to figure out ways that we can work together and actually figure out strategies in which we pull together, as opposed to having different narratives, competing narratives. JT talked about his evolution, about seeing how what we just really need is a better version of policing, a better version of prosecution, and somehow figuring out a way to kind of get in the same space and work together. I mean, I'll be the first to tell you, I mean, I used to be a prosecutor that used to believe that, my job was to go out and tell the world about what we do in the criminal justice system. And like my job was to educate people about this great system that we have in America. But as I've evolved as a human being, and if I come to know the harms that our systems have caused to communities, and I've learned so much from young people, and especially those young people and their families who are connected to the criminal justice system. One of the things that we're talking about youth violence. What I've learned in being in spaces with families and kids who are actually in our youth justice system, who are incarcerated in our detention centers, is that many of the kids, they carry guns because they feel that they're not safe, that they don't believe that the police will protect them. In fact, one young man told me that every day he wakes up and he feels like he's being hunted. And so is that an opportunity for, is it the best strategy for the police to be looking for that kid and find a gun on him, and then we process that person or that young person through the system as someone who's possessed a handgun illegally? Or should we be looking to understand what the needs of what his needs are, or what her needs are, what the needs of the family are, and work to intervene and try to prevent this situation, and also convince the young person to make the best choices possible given the circumstances. But you learn so much by just recognizing that to come to this work with some humility, and not the need to win an argument, but actually figuring out ways in which we can bring people together to solve some of these issues. And we've had some really good work done, because, at the height of some of the blaming and the attacking that was happening, I would say probably in 2020, at the height of the pandemic, we created a table called the Violence Reduction Leadership Group, and it was comprised of our sheriff, our police chief of our largest jurisdiction, leaders in corrections, our community leaders, our elected county commissioners. And at that time, we were experiencing a lot of repetitive crime committed by young people, carjackings, shootings, etc. And through this really hard conversation that we had, we all agreed that we did not want to have more youth prisons. What we wanted was just some types of interventions that would work, that would somehow figure out ways to provide the supports and services to the young people and their families. And through that conversation, we figured out a way to all legislation that would focus around intensive therapeutic services in a residential setting through the Health and Human Services side of our county. But that conversation, it took a while to get there, but we got all of the people that were blaming other parts of the system to agree that at the end of the day, what they wanted was something that was maybe local here, that would be utilizing community And also have some option for where it's a residential type of space where the doors are locked for some of the kids. But that was a hard conversation to get there, but that's kind of what it took to get people to realize that at the end of the day, this is what we could agree on.
Thanks, John. I want to step back a little bit and just ask about, because I think it came up so much in the comments and questions in the registration, to actually just talk a little bit about what you're seeing. John, you got into this a bit in the intro about just sort of what you're seeing in terms of violence, or what you're seeing with young people. I wonder, JT, if you could start maybe by, I know we've talked about how your role is expanded to go past Baltimore. Talk about what you're seeing in Baltimore. So just so that as everyone attending gets a sense of in your space and in your city, what you're seeing right now, and so how it compares to what other folks are experiencing themselves.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much the same. I mean, the group of young people at the center of this, at the center of urban violence mirror each other across cities for a lot. You see the high levels of trauma, right? You see the lack of access to resources and services. You see the high levels of poverty. You see lack of educational opportunities. You see, specifically in Baltimore. It's been all over the news, our failing school system. The majority of my young people, a lot of my young people that come to the program are high school diplomas, but they can't read. You know what I mean? So, that doesn't help me. I'd rather him not have a high school diploma so I can know where he really is, so we can really help move towards those educational gains, right? So, and what that does is that places young people in a position where they feel like it's almost survival of the fittest. It's no secret that we've had, troubles with our police department, and the corruption there and those types of things. So, just battling all those different elements that kind of wrap around this group of young people that are at this high risk, it's just really difficult because the trauma that they've suffered throughout their life is just so high that it's hard for them to respond to things the way that we think they should, right? But the mental capacity in the brain just isn't there because of the trauma that they've suffered.
Thanks, JT. And I'm because it's now come up twice in the chat, so I'm just going to put you on the spot. I know you can handle it. So there's been a couple questions related to law enforcement and just about, so I'll just read them. There were a couple that just came up and that are good questions. A comment saying it's hard for young people to feel safe around or near law enforcement because they've had a history of being targeted. And then a question that says, what does collaborating with law enforcement look like for an organization like Roca? I would assume that youth would be hesitant to be involved with something that law enforcement is part of. It's great questions, and I know this is a big part of what you do. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. Totally agree with the comment about it being hard for young people. It's hard for me still, to be honest. I understand in my work professional, my work capacity that, I have to look, doing this work is a continuous work on yourself at the same time, right? So the thing about it is I'm not trying to help young people understand anything that I didn't have to come to grips with myself. And part of that was changing the way that I thought about my interaction or how we deal with law enforcement. What I often heard was originally, let's defund police. But when I get deeper into that discussion with young people, that's not what they're actually saying. They're not saying we don't want police. They're saying we want police to do their jobs the right way, right? And if they don't, then let's think about how to get other resources that can do it a certain way, right? Communities want to feel safe. So the way that we did it, I remember, again, I'll go back to Molly telling me like, look, you got to find a handful of good cops. And I was like, Molly, I don't think a handful of good cops exists. So you're telling me basically to go pull a magic wand out of somewhere. And she's like, no, you got to find them. So to my surprise, we found them, right? And I will be honest with you, to this day, I would tell you that Baltimore City Police Department has been our best partner. I'll tell you why. Because it took for us to really have a lot of uncomfortable conversations to get where we needed to be. We started out just having small groups and we were just tearing each other apart in the room. Like, look, y'all do this to young people and y'all do this and we're having these debates back and forth about it. And then we finally come to a common ground like, well, look, this isn't solving anything. So what are we both trying to get to? Community safety. We want to help heal young people. And then what we started to notice was it started to become a genuine interest within the police department to really think about the fact that, look, we're hundreds of officers short. We know we can't do this by ourselves. We have to really start thinking about more community-based solutions and how do we support those solutions. One of my biggest things, or one of my biggest drawbacks, was like not trusting, always believing like, look, you have to trust that if the information can only flow one way. I cannot give you information about what my young people are doing on the streets, point blank, period. That's your job. Your job is to investigate it. My job is for you to identify the young people to me and me to offer them my intervention services, right? That's as clear cut as we are. Like, I don't care if you told a young person that he was referred to me by the police. I don't care, because I've already established a relationship with young people that they understand that I'm not going to snitch them out, or I'm not going to, we have developed our own credibility in that lane, where our credibility carries us through those questions because it's never happened. We don't flip on young people. As a matter of fact, I'll give you a quick story. I had a young person who had an open warrant. Police were outside my building, sitting outside in the parking lot of my building. I said, oh, nope. Called the commander, like, look, you got some officers from your warrant apprehension force outside my building getting ready trying to arrest one of my young people. I'm not letting them in the building. Okay, our building is a safe space. We agreed on this. I'm not letting them in, right? He's like, all right, let me see what's going on. I call him. I mean, he calls me back 10 minutes later. I look out the window. They're gone. I say, wow, okay. He really did. He followed through on his word. Now I got to follow through on my word. I got to try to talk to this young people and let this young person let him know why turning himself in for this would be the best move for him, right? We talked through it. We hemmed and hard over it. We talked through it. I got him to turn himself in. Let me tell you, it worked out so well that he was standing at my front door the next day at 5:30 in the morning, waiting for me to get to work, because he couldn't believe that he got arrested, he got walked through and got released just because we had that relationship with law enforcement. We had an understanding where, they know that we're working with him, but it's a paperwork thing. They had to get that arrest off the book. I mean, that weren't cleared, right? So helping people understand like kind of the premise of why some of these things have to take place, and then really helping them walk through the process. What I often say is that it's not about eliminating accountability. It's about how do we work together to make sure that we hold young people accountable, but we're also giving them the help to resolve the issues of trauma that caused them to be in a position that they're in the first place. Hope that kind of answered both of those questions.
Yeah, thanks, JT. And man, you jumped me again there, because I was
Sorry,
gonna.
I'm trying not to.
No,
I'm sorry.
like where you ended was great, because I wanted to talk about, because again, like I just enjoyed just preparing for this, but I was gonna ask John, and then you, and John, I'll turn to you. Accountability. I feel like this word that is not, it's like a 4-letter word. Sometimes it can feel like, because rather than us owning it as accountability should matter and accountability is essential, accountability gets associated with jail, with prison, with detention, with, corrections, whatever. Talk to me about accountability, because it feels like accountability has to be at the middle of this. But what do we mean by accountability, and how do we make sure we're not running away from it when we're talking about issues of youth violence and guns?
Yeah, well, thanks, Nate, for that question, because I think that if we don't have some measure of accountability, everything starts to fall apart. And so let me start by saying that I think the first thing for accountability is, like, for instance, if you're shooting at other people and you're trying to kill them, you have to get caught. And what I mean by that is that, like, somehow someone has to, like, stop you from doing that again and hold you to account for the harm that you might have caused to somebody else. Like, you oftentimes across this country, we have shootings that occur, but the person that got shot does not die. And they're saved many times because of the medical intervention. But oftentimes in those cases don't solve, meaning that the person who tried to kill the other person is never held accountable because the police can't solve that case. And the reason why they can't solve that case is because the person who got shot does not believe that they will be in a better situation or safer if they tell the police who might have shot them or a witness. So somehow we've got to figure out how to change that, because that's not working in America. In fact, the average clearance for those types of cases, I know for a fact, is probably about 25% or so around the country. In my jurisdiction, it's about 35%. The same can be said for the new crime of carjacking. That's happening all over cities across America with tall buildings. And less than probably 25%, 20%, maybe even less than 10% of those kids actually get caught, for there to be an opportunity for some authority that's backed by the community to say that you cannot do that. Right now, the question is, what do we do in response to that? I think the traditional way to fight that type of violent crime has been to deploy police and have them police everything, to focus on the little things, to pull people over, to find guns in back seats, to do harassment, all that kind of stuff, right? That's not going to make us safer. But if we catch that person, then we have to figure out ways in which we have that right type of accountability. And keep in mind that if someone is a youth, they're presumably in the youth or the juvenile justice system. So if it can be resolved there, it should be. Now, if you've killed somebody or you've done something egregiously violent, then across America, we're having conversations about whether or not youth should be certified as adults and things of that sort. Well, we got to separate out, I think, the big versus the little. We have to make sure that we actually solve these crimes, because I think that matters to community. I've heard from over and over from community about the frustration as well of crimes not being solved in a particular community. So I think that's a big part of it. And then I think in terms of accountability, I think we cannot just limit our minds to say that the only way to get accountability is, if you caused harm over here, we're going to cause harm to you. We got to keep in mind that for the youth justice system, especially, that the goal there should be to get the behavior to stop, that we need to do right by the victim, however that might be. In our traditional responses of having me as a prosecutor try to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that this young person committed the crime, and a defense attorney saying, making sure that I follow the Constitution and all of that, that adversarial process doesn't really work. I think that we have this really huge assumption in our country, because we've watched it on TV. It says so in the Sixth Amendment that everybody has a right to a trial or a jury trial. And that somehow through that process, truth and justice and all the good things that should happen. And they simply don't, because most things don't even go to a trial. What happens is it's a let's make a deal type of plea negotiation in our youth justice system. The prosecutor never has any idea about the humanity of the person that stands before them. And we, in many ways, have focused more on the person that's been harmed. And it's a system and a process that I just think that has not actually delivered a way to change behavior, and it actually puts more harm. And so if we can employ and include restorative practices as a part of all of this, include community in our response, I think that's going to, those types of approaches are going to be better. One of the things that we're doing in Ramsey County, although we don't use them for violent cases yet, but someday I believe that we will. But we have a way of making decisions about what we should do with a particular case, along with community, the voices from impacted community, about what our response should be, whether we should refer this to some sort of community-based accountability with restorative justice, whether we should have a traditional diversion program, whether we should file a petition. We actually share our power and our decision-making with representatives of the community to help us make those decisions so that they're, at the end of the day, more effective. And again, the effectiveness of what we want. And I know this to be true with every conversation I've ever had. We want that young person to make amends or to make right what harm that they have caused. They want that young person to, at the end of the day, try to make better choices and stop repeating that bad behavior that brought them into the system. And community should be involved and at the center of that.
Yeah, I'm so glad you ended there, John, because I know if people, I know I've been influenced a lot by Danielle Sered's book, Until We Reckon, and the idea of specifically when people have been physically harmed, that accountability is essential and it's owed to people who've been harmed. But what does that mean? What does accountability mean? And accountability being acknowledging responsibility for one's actions, acknowledging the impact of one's actions on others, expressing genuine remorse, taking actions to repair the harm if possible, and at the person who's been the victim to be the one who's talking about how to do that, and to commit to no longer committing similar harm to anybody else. Getting there in the current way that we do things through jail or prison, it doesn't get us there in that way. And so if we really want accountability, it's not just about saying accountability, but it's about actually having those things happen, which is a lot harder to have real accountability. I want to, we have about 25 minutes left with about 4 hours of questions that we could get to. So I'm going to have to jump through some things here. And I want to get to one question, a couple of questions in the chat, but I want to touch on some things that came in through the registration, because to me, I thought this nuance was really important in understanding what's going on. I love this about the questions we got. So I'm going to rattle through actually a few of them, and then maybe we can go and pick some ones to talk about. So in the registration, there were questions that sort of, some was about what can we do to limit the availability or access to guns for young people? Started on that supply side. What to do when kids feel they need guns to protect themselves? What sort of distinguishing between youth using guns to commit crimes versus committing crimes with guns in their possession? And I think the last one was just, what programs and approaches can focus on kids carrying guns? So I'm going to let you pick where you go. JT, I'll start with you. I mean, I guess one question I would have is this distinction between sort of self-protection versus carrying a gun to commit harm. I'm just curious how you think about that and what I know you talk about Roca, like Roca might be in a different situation, but talk about how you see that when you see young people in Baltimore or elsewhere.
Yeah, so a lot of times we miss the context, right? So when we're talking about accountability and why young people do what they do, we take a lot of context out of what actually happens. And what I mean by that is, if young people could feel genuinely safe to trust law enforcement, they might feel safer in their communities. But when we talk about accountability and we want young people to reckon with their victims, nobody's ever reckoning with the young people for the trauma that they've caused them, that they don't realize has pushed them into this life, right? So a lot of times we look at the young people as the perpetrators because we take the context out. But the majority of time, young people who are perpetrators have been victimized at some point in their life. And nobody has had any accountability for their victimization. It's basically almost like you're supposed to get over this, you're supposed to not do this and not perpetrate these crimes on other people. It's not that simple, right? But what I will say is that the trauma that young people suffer is real, which is why they feel, even in my program, it took us time to get young people to understand that our building was truly a safe space. But here's the reality: there's certain things that we have to put in place to make sure that we can hold that true. We never wanted or never patted down young people until the introduction of ghost guns. Now I have to, because a metal detector may not catch everything. I have to really think about the safety of young people if I'm bringing rivals into a building together to do programming, right? I have to make sure that everybody in that building feels safe. And I have to be able to ensure that. Why they don't feel safe or why they carry guns is because it's almost like the trend of people carrying pocket knives. Everybody carries one, right? You just carry a pocket knife. Now, I know that sounds extreme when it comes to guns, but you have to think about a lot of the environments that our young people live in. I literally have young people who tell me, Mr. JT, I cannot go anywhere without carrying my gun. And I will say to them, bro, if you go to church with your grandmother, you carrying a gun? And they'll say, yeah. And then I look at the news and here's a shooting of somebody leaving church with their grandmother. Right. So it's like, what do you want me to tell them at that time? Right. That's why our approach is less about telling them what to do and what not to do, and really about how do we address the trauma that promotes the behavior change, where a young person creates that mental safety that allows them to not feel like they have to be armed all the time. That's where my priority goes to, because part of your other question, Nate, was really relevant about the guns and being on the streets. And well, are we really addressing that as a country? Are we really cracking down on gun manufacturers and all these other places that people really should be looking at? No, we keep taking the context out and blaming where the guns end. The guns wind up in the streets with the young people who are highly traumatized. And, of course, they're going to carry out these certain things. But where is the accountability on the other side of it? It doesn't exist. So young people oftentimes feel stuck, trapped in situations that they're in. And it's hard for us to imagine it. But that's because most of us have, or a lot of us haven't been in that situation. But those of us who have, it makes perfect sense why they don't feel safe. It makes perfect sense why they operate the way that they do, which is why the last thing I'll say real quick, which is why we have to focus on this brain science and behavior change. Because we know that if we can start to treat the trauma, right, then we can help young people. This is what I said to I said this to my staff. We were having a meeting and we were talking about one of these incidents. I think it was after George Floyd. And I said to them, I was like, or maybe it was one of them. And I said, you know what, as a Black man in America, I've never felt unsafe in my own city. I feel so unsafe as a Black man, and I'm grown. And I know I don't run the streets no more. And I was like, I feel so unsafe, right? And I'm like, damn it, if I go through that, I imagine what my young people go through, right? And why they feel unsafe and the things that they have to deal with daily. So again, but I always will take it back to the point that the accountability is important. We have to figure out the right way to do it, because while we're promoting behavior change, if we aren't promoting accountability at the same time, then it encourages them not to follow the behavior change if there are no consequences, right? So there have to be consequences, but the consequences, happy to hear Mr. Choi say the consequences are really something that you think about. Like, how do we really get the effects that we want through these consequences, and how do we really make it a way where it really helps address not only the young person's trauma, but then also gets to what the real root is, right? And I could go on. I'm gonna just stop there.
I can tell. I'm wondering. Yeah, John, do you want to respond to any of that, or yeah, go ahead. I want to. There's something I want to ask you particularly, but go, please jump in. Go ahead.
Well, I'm so glad that JT talked about the supply side, because we cannot have a conversation about violence without calling out the fact that there are too many guns that are too freely available in our communities. And there is, we need to have accountability on that front and that conversation. So, anything that people can do on this call to encourage their legislatures just to have simple, universal background check can certainly make a difference. I don't know how this proliferation of ghost guns happened, but these kits are available on the internet, and maybe there needs to be stronger penalties, not for the people that possess the ghost guns, but for the people that are selling these kits or selling the things that are necessary to make these guns when it's clear that's what is happening there. So I think some laws and some courage on the part of lawmakers to take on the National Rifle Association. I mean, I will just call out that special interest. They're protecting the manufacture and the sale of these guns in our country. And if truly guns made us safer, we would truly be the safest country on this planet. But we are not. So I think that's a really important part of it too. And I think another piece that I wanted to just delve into a little bit about, and maybe we need to get Roca here to St. Paul, but it is just really challenging and frustrating oftentimes with trying to get that behavior to change. So I've learned to recognize that I got to have patience with this, that you just can't expect results with behavior change immediately. But what's frustrating oftentimes is that I think a lot of times gun violence in our communities is very, very predictable. If we put it in the context of group violence, In fact, you know that this group has got a beef with this group over here, and something just happened, and maybe there's a funeral that's happening, and we have all of these navigators and people that are in our community working with young people to tell them not to go to the funeral or whatever it might be, or to make a different choice. But the frustrating thing for us is that sometimes it just doesn't matter. And the boys end up going to the funeral, and then lo and behold, there's actually a shooting, right? And then someone else loses their life. And this repetitive nature about how to actually effectively do this work. We have like group violence interventions and CVI in our community. We have a cure violence model. We have a hospital-based intervention model. And I know that like doubling down and doing more of this is a big part of the solution, but it can be just really frustrating because some days you just don't see the results. Because I think in some ways the kids that we're talking about, they're so deep into the trauma, and to not see anything to have hope in the future, that these decisions for them are very rational. Like it's in many ways, they're not caring about their own life. They're not caring about their own future. And when you get to that level, it's just really hard. And we've got some hard-working community navigators and violence interrupters, but it's been hard to try to change that behavior.
Yeah, thanks, John. So we have like 15 minutes left. There's a lot of ways we can go. One question that came up a couple times in the chat had to do with this sort of convincing people to take on efforts like perhaps the kind of work that you're doing, JT, with and raising the question about evidence. Now, I know Roca has a lot of evidence, but as people in the chat, I'm glad people have said, like, you don't need Roca to be doing this kind of thing alone. There are organizations in every community that are credible at the street level, who understand what's going on, know people, and can do this type of work. I'm glad someone asked that question because it feels like a good one. And I don't know if I'm asking it, John, to you or you to JT, but this always kills me because, the alternatives when we're talking about accountability of detention and residential placement have no evidence, no good evidence, let's just say, no positive evidence that they work, right? And we don't have any for probation either. So we have a lot of evidence of what doesn't work, and it's the things that we would fall back on. So I guess my question would be, it's an important one, though, that whether we have evidence in the traditional sense or just the confidence. I mean, I think, John, I really am glad how you're talking about this. Like, even when we know we're doing the right stuff, it's like, it's not easy. Like, maybe it's doubling down. Maybe it's that. I love, JT, when you're talking about sort of just the relentless, like, knocking on the door 1,000 times kind of thing. But how do you talk to people about this? Because the worst thing, it would seem to me, sorry, I'm not a good neutral facilitator, I'll just say that up front. But the worst thing it seems like we could do is like not try things that have a lot behind them out of fear of like that we haven't done a random, clinical trial to prove that something works. Like, this is a time we need ideas and need to put them into action. So I hope I didn't answer my own question, but like, how do you think about that? John, do you want to go at that first about the evidence question?
Well, I'm sure JT can point to some evidence or research that the Roca model is working, and there are evidence-based, solutions. So people talk about GVI or CVI. And those programs are very, very flexible. They can be modeled after what the community wants, but there has to be fidelity to the basic premise of what GVI is all about. But there's actually proof that when you employ those strategies with fidelity, that you actually reduce gun violence in certain neighborhoods or wherever you're focused. So I think the key is to have fidelity to the model and make sure that you're doing that. But I think the data and the research, I mean, I always tell people that this violence interruption, this getting community navigators involved as a part of the new kind of infrastructure of how we respond to violence is a good thing. Number one, the police want it. I mean, I think now the police are recognizing that they can't do all of this alone. And in fact, the tools that they've been given actually cause more distrust and more harm for communities. And so I'm seeing that evolution of recognizing that their tactics aren't necessarily going to save the day. And I hope that the community and the public can understand that. And so we got to try something different. But I always tell people that this field of violence interruption, it's been around for now a little bit, but it's still relatively novel. It's just still being developed out, and there's good examples across the country. I think lots of legislatures are starting to invest in these types of violence interruption and prevention types of strategies. But I do think that one of the things that the field or the profession needs to recognize is that somehow we've got to figure out ways to be able to define our successes. Some of it is anecdotal stories, but in some ways, I think we've got to figure out ways to talk about things in some way of metrics and research to show that there's effectiveness, that you spend this kind of money, we'll get this kind of return. And I think some of this stuff is also long-term, that you may not see the dividends for a long time, where maybe you're reducing the cycle of incarceration, but that might take a long time, or you're figuring out a way to address generational types of harms and undoing some of that. I really think that we're reaping some of the negative outcomes of our past incarceration. One of the greatest traumatic indicators are when you've got a parent who's incarcerated. Mm-hmm. And we certainly did a lot of that back in the 90s and the 2000s. And I think in many ways it becomes generational. And we've got it. We can't, I don't think we can go on like this, where we have a certain segment of our population that continues to be connected with our mass incarceration response.
Thanks, John. Yeah, JT, you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, really quick. I mean, I agree. I agree with everything that was said, which is why, look, I've always said this for years, there is no one game in town, right? It's about what works best for you and your community, which is why, I don't promote that every city needs a Roca. What I promote is that every city needs what works for them. They need to figure out what works for them, right? The reason that we started the Impact Institute was that we understood that actually starting brick and mortars all across the country just wasn't going to be productive. Like starting Baltimore just drained us, right? So we knew that we had a product at our Rewire CBT that could really help other communities though. But the one thing we do is go in listening first. I don't go in and sell you a product and tell you oh, this product is great, it's going to change your life, it's going to make everything safe. That's not the way the landscape of violence works, But what I can tell you is that we have something that we developed that works for our young people, that helps them with their behavior change, that works for the people who actually do the work, because a lot of times when we employ people to do this work, we don't take into consideration the trauma that the people who are doing the work have experienced their life, and how much of that still exists when we put them out there to do the work. So you can't send the alcoholic into a liquor store. Maybe once he's gotten treatment, he can go in and work at the liquor store, but not right from the beginning. So where do we stop and heal the healers? First of all, we have to address the trauma that the people we're sending out to do this tough work have experienced through their lives before they even get out there to start working with people to try to change their lives. Because the most trusted people in the community are usually people who have deep connections to that community. Deep connections to that community means that they have historical trauma from dealing with the connections to that community, which means that if their trauma isn't addressed coming through the door, a lot of things that they're doing when they're treating community resurfaces. And I could give a perfect example. You have to think about, oftentimes police officers have community trauma, probation officers, juvenile justice officers, juvenile justice people have trauma, and the community have trauma. So what we've looked at is, how do we address that in each way? So with our Rewire CBT, we started the Rewire 4 for police officers, 4 skills that teach police officers how to emotionally regulate. Because we want to put accountability on young people and community. Nope. Let's scale back and put a little bit of accountability on you first, because y'all need to learn some emotional regulation yourselves, right? So we'll start there. Then we go into the facilities and work with juvenile justice and probation officers inside those facilities. Like, nah, y'all need to learn some emotional regulation when you're working with these young people. Because part of what happens is when you send them into these places and they get mistreated, it only compacts the trauma, right? It compacts the trauma, and it actually doesn't help when a young person comes out. It makes them come out more angry. They come out more angry and more willing to do things than when they went in, right? So we have to look at it from every layer is basically what I'm getting at. It's no one entity that has to change on their own. It's a collaboration. We all have to really figure out how to do this together and really figure out where the changes need to happen, because the trauma is real and everybody has suffered from a certain level of trauma.
Thank you. We have 6 minutes left. This is great. Both of you, the last question we just got in the chat referred to the holiness of recidivism, which just made me giggle, because I think what you're both talking about speaks to that the ambitions that you have and how you're thinking about success is a lot bigger than whether or not someone's rearrested in a certain. You're sort of, this is a real world, and we're thinking about things, and ideally we're hoping for people to thrive in life and not just be absent of police intervention in their lives. So I think I'm glad someone brought that up, because when we're talking about these efforts, Roca certainly isn't setting the bar as simply having our participants not be rearrested. We want that for their lives, but that's not enough. So we've got 5 minutes left. So I guess I just would ask both of you, and maybe start with you, John, just anything else that comes to mind. I feel like we've covered a lot of ground. There's a lot more that we could get into as you're sort of looking ahead. And again, I'll just say we're about to go back to the main room, and then we'll go to a next set of sessions. And that's going to be focused on the long term. And I like, John, how you said, like, hopefully what we're experiencing now, if it feels like an uptick, that's going away, and we'll get there, and we want, but there's always going to be violence, and this is not a new thing. And I think to the questions in the chat, and I appreciate that it comes in, that we're a country flooded in guns. There's more guns than people in our country. This is what we've chosen, and in that context, we can't be shocked when young people are guns. So we'll get into the long term in a second, but I'm just wondering, any closing thoughts, John, and then JT, before we leave the room?
Well, I think I'll just start with, and maybe reiterating kind of a little bit about what JT said, and I said maybe at the very beginning part of this, is that just through the experiences that I've had as an elected county attorney, and I'm a very different prosecutor than I was when I first started back in 2010. But what I've come to realize and learn is that when we come to the table, or just me as a human being, when I come to the table and I feel like I know and have all of the answers, or I have to be right, that's when I think have failed the most. And so I think coming to this work with I'm not sure exactly who's in the part of the audience, but I think we have lots of champions for justice. But for all of you to come to this table with humility and to recognize that our success is actually going to be found in our ability to partner with and learn from our community, especially the community that's the most impacted. And that we have to find ways in which we can work across interagency. I think lately we've been hearing a lot of negative things about the police, and rightfully so. There were many things that needed to change about that profession that still haven't changed about that profession, but need to change. But we all need to be a part of lifting up the new version or a better version of what that policing should look like. We have a responsibility to I think reimagine our correctional systems, reimagine our prosecutions, all of that. But we all need each other to help and be a part of that conversation. And again, it's got to be centered around community, and especially that aspect of our community that's never been invited to the table. And that is really, I believe, our path forward. And together, I think that everybody on this call who is trying to make their community better and or their justice systems better will just be better together. Thank you.
Thanks, John. JT, I'm gonna give you the last word. You got 2 minutes or maybe even a little less.
Nate, that's impossible for me. But no, look, real quick, I'll just say I thank you for the opportunity. It's always great to be in these spaces where we can have these conversations. What I will encourage is people to have the uncomfortable conversations that need to be had within your community that really will help foster collaboration. Have those fights, have those arguments, get it out the way so that the young people and the people in the community don't continue to suffer. We have to come to face the realities of, a lot of things in the past. And I think John has said that a lot of things that in the past that just weren't done right. Like, we need to have those difficult conversations and really bring to bear some of the things that could really help our young people, help our communities. And I don't know, just those who are doing the work, keep at it, man. We can't stop. We gotta stay in it. We gotta stay in it. We can't get discouraged. We gotta keep pushing forward. So I just thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, JT, and thanks everyone for participating in the session, for all the questions. You're both getting a lot of love, John and JT. So thank you for doing that. And everyone, there's a little button that now says, I think, leave room. You can go back to the main room, and we'll get to choose our next session. So thank you all.